Greetings, everyone. All right, I'm hitting a timer right now so that I don't be too wordy today because we got a lot to cover. Ideally, I would not cover both of these topics in one video, but circumstances have dictated it. So, our video today is bought by Glorious T and Star Wars. So, let's kick it. All right, World War II has started. Thus, for the United States at least. It's been going on for a few years in Europe and Asia, but the United States needs people to fight, people to be involved in the war effort. Thus, two things happen. Number one, 5 million people volunteer to fight in the war. Secondly, the United States puts into effect the selective service, which drafts 10 million more people. The U.S. also puts into place here, as you see on the right in this poster, the WAAC, also known as the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. There are certainly some men that are like, women have no place in the military. Obviously, they're just sexist, and many thousands of women join. They're in non-combat roles, but they service things like nurses, ambulance drivers, radio operators, electricians, pilots, thus adding more great ability to the army. There are certainly a lot of people that are not particularly happy about getting or having to register. If you look at this image here, this is a registration card. So, in particular, we have a variety of people, namely a lot of African Americans are not particularly happy about being drafted into the army, namely because they've been discriminated against in the United States, and now the United States is asking them to help. There's a great quote by one man who said, "Just carve my tombstone. Here lies a black man killed fighting a yellow man for the protection of a white man." This theme we'll see in a month or so repeats itself in Vietnam. However, there is a massive amount of minority groups that joined the war. You have about 300,000 Mexican Americans, 13,000 Chinese Americans, 33,000 Japanese Americans, 25,000 Native Americans, and over 1 million African Americans join the army in World War II. Now, it's not just army people that are needed. We also have a huge mobilization of scientists, namely to start research into the atomic bomb. It's not just that, however. These scientists do a lot of research in stuff like radar, stuff like developing more better technology for ships and planes, sonar so they can detect German U-boats under the water. So these scientists are really trying to contribute to helping make the army more productive. But we also have, of course, the very large project to develop the nuclear bomb. Here are sites all over the country that were involved in what's known as the Manhattan Project to develop a working nuclear bomb. The largest of these factories, or not factories, research centers was Los Alamos. This is an image of Oak Ridge in Tennessee, but they are successful, as we will look in class later on this week. So, with all these people, all these scientists, all these individuals working together in the United States, the war then moves, for the United States at least, outside. And the first kind of stage, first area of this is in the Atlantic. So the biggest problem for the United States is that the Germans are very effective at attacking ships. In the first 7 months of 1942, the Germans sink over 700 Allied ships in the Atlantic. And this cannot continue because supplies, troops need to get over to Europe. So what the United States develops is something called the convoy system. You have strength in numbers. So this is a photograph of a convoy. And the bottom right, you see a plane flying over. So convoy system in its most basic form is just many ships traveling together. And with those ships, you have aircraft carriers so that planes can fly overhead. And these planes are used to spot, uh, namely German submarines, so that they can use their new technologies, radar and sonar, as these convoys to attack the submarines, which up to this point were very effective at taking out American ships. By the spring of 1943, so a little less than a year later, after the Germans were so successful, Germans essentially realized that their U-boats had been decimated, that the Americans were too effective at sinking their U-boats, and they ended up really limiting those operations there, allowing a much more free flow of ships in the Atlantic. So we're going to bounce around here. We're jumping to Russia now. So while the United States is mobilizing in the west of Europe, in the east of Europe, namely in Russia, where the Germans had mounted a offensive in 1941, the very popular knowledge for most people is never to invade Russia. And while initially the Germans are fairly successful in Russia, their main move in 1942 is to capture the oil fields and to destroy Stalingrad, which is a massive industrial city for Russia. And in the background, you have this very creepy photograph that I quite enjoy of Stalingrad burning in the background. And by the Germans were able to capture 9/10 of the city, which is fairly impressive. It's a massive city. It's an industrial city. It's producing a lot of the Russian war goods. And the Germans do capture much of it. However, as everyone knows, Russian winter is not a particularly pleasant thing. So when the winter comes late 1942, the Russians decide to mount an offensive against the Germans, which the Germans at this point are just hoping to die because they're all freezing to death. By the end of the offensive, Germans surrender. January of 1943, 230,000 Germans die. But that's nothing compared to Russians, of which 1.1 million Russians die in this one battle, which is absolutely devastating for the Russians and explains why after the war the Russians treat the Germans absolutely terribly, because they've been, in many cases, the worst combatant-wise treated of the entire war. This war is massive. That's why it's World War. In North Africa, where if you look at the map at the bottom right, either the French, which had controlled much of Africa, who are now controlled by Germany. The French territories are now being taken over by the Germans. They namely wanted to use it as their breadbasket, as this area has commonly been used for. So in North Africa, the Allies invade in 1942 with 107,000 troops. They are led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, future president. And Eisenhower is leading his troops against the Desert Fox, also known as Erwin Rommel, who's a fantastic strategist for the German army. And once the Americans, as they tend to do in war, push back, at least this war, push back the German army, they then move into Italy, which is invaded in after May of 1943. And in Italy, you have actually a lot of these groups that I mentioned before, Mexican Americans, African American groups, the Tuskegee Airmen, who are an all African American Air Force unit. They are awarded a number of citations, 2 distinguished unit citations, a Mexican American unit known as the Company E of the 141st Regiment. Of those soldiers, 17 of them are awarded the Medal of Honor in Italy, and which turns it into one of the most decorated units in all of the war. So after Africa, they move into Italy. There's also fighting going on in India. So the U.S. gets all over the place. Um, the biggest move, though, probably the most famous part of World War II, maybe in the top four, is D-Day, where the Allied forces they've been staging in England. You have 3 million troops staging in England for something called Operation Overlord. And Operation Overlord's launched June 6, 1944. And fighting continues on the beaches of France. The Allied troops eventually secure, after intense fighting, the Germans knew this was coming, 80 miles of French coastline. They land the largest force of troops in world history. And for 7 days, or by August 23rd, so uh, 2 months later, the Allied forces get into Paris and liberate Paris, and then also have control of all of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. So at this point, the Germans are really being pushed back. Their final hurrah is something called the Battle of the Bulge. If you look at this map on the right, essentially the Germans push into American lines. It creates a bulge in the front as their really last ditch effort to try to stop the American advances into Germany. It fails. It's a month-long battle, however. Germans lost 120,000 troops, 600 tanks, 1,600 planes. It's a massive, devastating blow to the German war effort, and is really the last hurrah of the Germans. Around this point, you have the Russians closing in the east as well. The Russians are the first ones to encounter Nazi death camps, which they liberate in June or July of 1944. And they just see this utter devastation. The Germans are trying to destroy evidence of what was going on there. They can't, which for history is very good. And for the people that they weren't able to kill is also very good. There's a quote by a Russian soldier, or I think American soldier. When he came into the camp, he said, "For the first time, I truly realized the evil of Hitler and why this war had to be waged." Which for a lot of these Americans, yes, they understand that there's a war going on, but really it's until they see these death camps, what the extent of the Holocaust has been, is really when they acknowledge how important this war was. With VE Day, April 30th, Hitler kills himself and his wife shoots himself. His wife swallows poison. He had ordered his bodies to be soaked in gasoline and burned, which happens. And a week later, there's unconditional surrender of the German army. And on May 8th, 1945, we have Victory in Europe Day, also known as VE Day. Now, while the war has been won in Europe, means the war is not over, namely because the war in the Pacific is still raging on. So, in the Pacific, all of this is happening, but Roosevelt, our president, who has been president for all through the Great Depression into this war, dies. He has a stroke, and on April 12th, 1945, Roosevelt is dead. So he does not see VE Day. However, he kind of knows that the end is near. And Harry Truman becomes the next president, this man here on the right. But in the Pacific, we have intense fighting, some of the most intense fighting of the war, namely because they're happening on islands. And certainly Europe is a wide open space, so you can spread out. But in the Pacific, you have horrible fighting in very small quarters. So after Pearl Harbor, American forces move into namely the South Pacific. So if you look down here, this is all Japanese territory by 1942. Japanese have even taken some Aleutian Islands, which are part of the United States. Well, at this point, I believe they are part of Russia. But it might still be part of Russia. You can fact check me on that one. But all the way down to above Australia. So American forces start in the Coral Sea down here and start to move their way. So having taken most of the control, 80,000 Americans, namely, they start invading the Philippines, which is terrible fighting. However, we have this raid on Japan and Tokyo by a pilot named Doolittle, which starts to bring the war closer to the Japanese. They start to get a bit anxious about this war and their goals. Um, Battle of Midway is one of the important turning points of this war. If you look over here, we have the Midway Islands. So, Battle of Midway, the Americans surprised the Japanese fleet. They destroyed 4 aircraft carriers, a cruiser, 250 planes. It's really this first pushback of the Japanese. And it starts this tactic known as island hopping, where the Americans start to hop from island to island. They're not taking every island, but what they realize is if they take one island and then an island 50 miles past that, 50 miles past that, if there's Japanese troops in between, they're cut off from supplies. So the Americans correctly realize that they don't need to conquer every piece of territory that the Japanese have already taken. They just need to cut off the Japanese troops. And of the battles of this war, Iwo Jima is probably maybe the most important and devastating battle of the war. It happens after this Battle of Guadalcanal, which is absolutely terrible, and where you start to see kamikaze attacks. Kamikaze means divine wind. It's a throwback to there's a failed Russian invasion of Japan, which fails because of a storm that comes up. So the storm becomes known as this divine wind. So kamikazes, as you probably know, are suicide pilots that are actually wildly effective, much more effective than traditional fighting tactics of just crashing into ships. And there's a great quote of one sailor. Sailors watch with strange mixture of respect and pity. You have to admire the devotion to country demonstrated by these pilots. Yet when they were shot down, rescued, and brought aboard, we were surprised to find these pilots looked like ordinary scared young men, not the wide-eyed fanatical devils we imagined them to be. So even the sailors on these ships that are being attacked are kind of in somewhat respectful of the courage of these people. But after retaking the Philippines in these terrible battles, Guadalcanal, the U.S. moves closer to Japan. And namely, they focus on Iwo Jima, where there's an air base the U.S. hopes to be able to use to attack Japan's mainland. In this battle, there's 20,700 Japanese troops stationed on Iwo Jima. After the battle's over, 6,000 Americans had died, and only 200 Japanese were alive. So almost 99% of the Japanese forces in Iwo Jima were killed. I missed some of these slides here. Here's the Battle of Midway. We also then have the Battle of Okinawa, which will be the last thing we talk about today. Getting on to Japanese islands much closer to the mainland. There's 1,900 kamikaze pilots are sent to attack forces during this Battle of Okinawa. They sunk 30 ships. They killed 5,000 sailors, just these troops alone. And by the end of the battle, 7,700 Americans were died and 110,000 Japanese forces. All right, this video is the longest video ever. I apologize. However, we had a lot to cover, so thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.